My name is Connie Chang. I'm faculty in the History Department and Environmental Studies program and Director of Environmental Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the kickoff event for the ES program's 50th anniversary symposium. I want to begin by noting that Bowdoin College is located on the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki. Today, the Wabanaki include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations who have deep and enduring relationships with Maine's lands and waterways. We acknowledge the painful legacy of the region's colonial history and commit to better understanding it while also celebrating the vibrancy of Native American cultures and working to build a more inclusive community. I share this statement because any conversation about the environment should include the violent dispossession of indigenous lands and waters, the same lands and waters that we study and strive to protect today. So for the next 2 days, we will be commemorating the 50th anniversary of ES by taking in the collective knowledge and wisdom of 14 esteemed alumni, all of whom have impressive careers in the environmental field. I'd like to begin by thanking them all for taking time away from their families and their jobs to come to Maine. Inside your program, you'll see the schedule of alumni panels for tomorrow, and I really hope that you'll be able to join us. In addition, on the back of your program, you'll see details for 2 student-curated exhibits that are now on view. Woods Water World, Environmental Studies at Bowdoin, curated by Lizzie Kaplan, is on the 2nd floor of the Hawthorne Longfellow Library and charts the history of the ES program and the broader study of the environment at the college. Human Nature, Environmental Studies at 50, curated by John Auer, Tess Davis, Sophia Hurst, Hayden Keene, and Braden Lozano under the direction of Professor Matt Klingel, is in the Becker Gallery at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art and features pieces from the museum's permanent collection as well as from the Arctic Museum and Special Collections. I am deeply grateful to this group of students for their brilliant work. And thanks also to Marika van der Steenhoven, Casey Braun, Sean Kramer, and Frank Goodyear for their assistance and support. I'm also extremely grateful for our sponsors, and first and foremost, I want to thank the Office of the Dean for Academic Affairs for their incredible generosity, which allowed us to realize our ambitious vision for this event. I'd also like to thank our other sponsors, the Africana Studies, Arctic Studies, and Environmental Studies programs, and Urban Studies minor, the Departments of Anthropology, Biology, English, Government and Legal Studies, History, Sociology, and Visual Arts, Career Exploration and Development, the McKean Center for the Common Good, the Bowdoin Outing Club, the Bowdoin Organic Garden, the Office of Sustainability, and the Climate Action Speaker Initiative. Student group sponsors include Bowdoin Citizens Climate Lobby, Bowdoin Naturalists, and Bowdoin Sunrise. So obviously a lot of groups and individuals made this possible. Finally, I want to thank my ES colleagues who assisted with the planning of this event beginning last summer. Special thanks to Eileen Johnson and Rosie Armstrong, who were always thoughtful and conscientious as we finalized our plans. Rosie, in particular, poured an inordinate, I really mean that, inordinate amount of care energy, and enthusiasm into this event and attended to literally every last detail. She kept dozens of balls in the air with grace and good humor. So thank you, Rosie, wherever you are, I can't see, for your boundless dedication and impeccable professionalism. And now I'm going to hand over things to my colleague, Matt Klingel, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
I always wanted a purple background. This is great. Before we get started, these things, silence them, turn them off, smash them, but make sure they don't make noise during the presentation. Also, we will have 2 microphones when the lights come back on. We'd like you to use those microphones when you're asking questions of Dr. Williams, because we are recording this, and if we don't have the microphone, then we can't hear you on the recording. And it also will make it easy for those of us in the audience that are of advanced years to hear you as well. Finally, I want to second again the thank you to Rosemary Armstrong, who is, if you want to use a shipbuilding metaphor, the tiller, the rudder, and the hull for the ES program. But I also want to thank my colleague, Connie Chang, who several years ago began to have the initial conversations with colleagues at the Museum of Art, with colleagues in the Environmental Studies program, with the Dean for Academic Affairs in the Office of the President, and so many other people on campus to look ahead to make this possible to celebrate the 50th anniversary. So a lot of that goes unseen, emails, negotiations, discussions, budgets. So I want to thank her, and also another thanks to Rosie, who truly is fantastic. So my name is Matt Klingel. Somehow people forget it's Matthew, but that's okay. My mom, well, she calls me Matt too. And I'm an associate professor of history and environmental studies, and it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Teona Williams. First, a bit on how we got here. About 18 months ago, when the core ES faculty began envisioning how to best honor the program and its mission, we decided that we wanted to highlight our alumni and our students. We also wanted to showcase how their work and values are grounded in the liberal arts. As we often say, ES is where the liberal arts converge and merge. And finally, we agreed to focus mostly on recent graduates who came of age after the initial environmental movement that spawned the ES program had morphed into something far more complex, interdisciplinary, and diverse. So, Teona embodies in word and deed the highest aspirations of ES, as we call it here at Bowdoin. But like many polar bears past and present, the now accomplished scholar, teacher, and activist here with us this evening was once an unsure, if talented and curious student. I met that student in the spring of 2009 when she took my first year seminar on the idea of the frontier in the United States. Teona's early writing, to be honest, was uneven. A knowing laugh that I know well. Yet it crackled with ideas, which she shared in our lively discussions. And her writing quickly improved, as did her confidence. For her term paper, she avoided the usual suspects in a class such as mine, such as gunslingers or pioneers, instead exploring how the famed Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black infantry and cavalry deployed to suppress indigenous resistance in the post-Civil War West, upended cherished assumptions behind the so-called frontier myth of individual achievement. As she argued, the color line was often as bold and brutal in the West as it was in the Jim Crow South. By the end of her first year, Teona demonstrated the qualities that would drive her accomplishments at Bowdoin and beyond: curiosity unbound by convention, and formidable smarts driven by hard work. When she declared her major in ES and history the following year with a minor in Africana studies, I was ecstatic. Over the next 3 years, Teona gave Bowdoin her full send. She worked as a student employee for the history department and volunteered for a long list of local charities. She was an inaugural out-of-the-zone leadership training candidate for the Bowdoin Outing Club, and later as a certified trip leader, brought a wide range of students into the Maine outdoors and beyond. She was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow and a McKean Center fellow, served as treasurer for what is now the Black Student Union, interned as an ES fellow at the Nature Conservancy of Maine, won a Udall fellowship, and after graduation was a Watson fellow studying ecotourism in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. She applied the same zeal to her post-Bowdoin endeavors. After a stint at the Pew Charitable Trust as an assistant on the Global Oceans Legacy Project, she attended the University of Michigan's School for Environment and Sustainability, or CEAS, S-C-A-S. Well, did I get that right? Seas now. Okay. All right. Rising tide, seas. Got it. While in Ann Arbor, she wrote her master's thesis under the direction of Dr. Dorcetta Taylor, an acclaimed scholar of environmental justice and racism, who I might add was so impressed by Teona that she followed her to Yale. That's a joke. She didn't, but she's now at Yale. But I like to think that. She also worked to promote diversity and inclusion while studying at Michigan Seas, and her colleagues recognized her efforts with the Samuel Dana Trask Award for Leadership and Service. As I said before, full send. However, to be honest, the one time I was worried about Teona's seemingly endless energy was when she decided to pursue her doctorate in history. Academia can be a brutal place. The jobs are scarce, expectations often unreasonably high, and the pressure for conformity often unbearable, if not inescapable. I gave Teona what I call the talk, but she had heard it before and decided to apply anyway. I'm grateful she did. And when she got to Yale, one of many places that wisely admitted her, she returned to full send mode. What has impressed me more than Teona's accomplishments, however, has been her enduring commitment to seeing scholarship, teaching, and activism as part of a vital whole. While in New Haven and Ann Arbor, Teona made time to be an engaged citizen, and that engagement shaped her scholarship. As she'll discuss tonight, she has a capacious definition of what counts as the environment. It helps her to explain why some communities have been more privileged in their connections to nature than others over time. For Teona, state-sanctioned brutality and interpersonal violence are essential to defining and studying the environment as global climate change or vanishing biodiversity. In her reckoning, Fannie Lou Hamer and June Jordan are as much of any canonical environmentalist pantheon as John Muir or Rachel Carson, perhaps even more so today. Yet Teona is doing so much more than simply recovering lost stories or reclaiming unsung individuals. She is pushing the very boundaries of what we call nature and who gets to label it. Little wonder then that she has become an academic of some renown so early in her career. She's making a living at what the late politician and civil rights leader John Lewis famously called good trouble. As an environmental historian, I'm tempted to explain Teona's allegiances as rooted in part to her place, to her home. Born and raised in southeastern D.C., a proud resident of the DMV, her next-door neighbor was the Anacostia River, a tributary of the Potomac that flows through an urbanized and diverse community of almost 1 million people, the lower reaches of which are primarily African-American and largely poor. Once choked with pollution, the Anacostia is flowing toward a cleaner if uncertain future, but is not what many environmentalists today or 50 years ago would consider a great waterway of pristine grandeur. I know Teona would disagree with such shallow views. As she wrote in her 2018 award-winning essay on policing and racial inequities on Chicago's South Side, she sees, quote, "Blackness is deeply necessary for the maintenance of urban ecosystems and critical to the preservation of socio-ecological systems," end quote. Put another way, nature and society are inseparable and reciprocal, and so identifying and healing the harms to one requires the same action toward the other. The Anacostia River, then, has as much greatness in its waters as any river anywhere. Teona's life and work are a powerful embodiment of Bowdoin's environmental studies program. So it is altogether fitting that she gives a keynote this evening, which so many of our alumni are in attendance for the panels tomorrow. And I suspect her talk this evening will both be a call to action and a hymn of hope. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Teona Williams.
Wow, every time I talk to Matt, I'm trying to convince him to do my projects for me because he knows better than I do what it is I'm trying to accomplish in this world. So hello, everyone. I wanted to flag really quickly, and make sure I have my clicker here, that I'm seeing this PowerPoint more as an album of environmental justice activism, so you don't really have to follow it to follow this talk. And I want to sort of open with saying that it's such an honor to be back here at Bowdoin celebrating 50 years of environmental studies on campus. Where did the time even go? And again, thank you so much to Matt for that overly generous introduction. As I was sort of writing this talk, I realized that you, Connie, Eileen, Rosie, and so many others have been in my life for 14 years now. And I thank you all for always making me feel like I belonged at Bowdoin. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Connie Chang, Dr. Eileen Johnson, and Rosie Armstrong, and really everyone who worked so hard to put together today's and tomorrow's event. I already feel so grateful, and I already feel so full. But before I begin, I'm a little short, so you can't really see, but I am wearing my union button. And I want to acknowledge that all 4 of Rutgers' unions are on strike right now. We are making demands for livable wages, not just for ourselves, but also for our undergraduate students who are deeply impacted by the pandemic. I stand here in solidarity, and I hope you all join me in solidarity as we continue to pursue our ongoing labor struggles. So the title of my talk, We're Going to Be Okay Now, is actually a line from June Jordan's unpublished novel, Okay Now. And June Jordan, for those of you who may not be familiar, she's a Black feminist poet, educator, environmentalist, right? Although she's often not put into that canon. And so Okay Now is a fictional account of Black families leaving the North for better futures in Mississippi. And because of this, I decided to dedicate tonight's talk to June Jordan. Jordan, in my opinion, was one of the most profound environmental philosophers of our time. So to June, thank you for loving Black diaspora communities with every bone in your body. So Jordan wrote the line, "We're going to be okay now," as a way to embody how radical land reform would set Black people free. And in her mind, radical land reform critiqued US imperialism, an ever-growing defense budget, and the ongoing assault on Black life. So I take her phrase as my title to honor her legacy. But I also take the line because it serves as a critical lens in which to understand my own experiences as a scholar in environmental studies. I sit with June's words to ask myself, what does it take for us to be okay now? How do we get free? Through my experiences as an environmental justice scholar and comrade, I have had the privilege to learn from activists on the ground on what it takes to get free. And I hope to share these lessons as we commemorate 50 years of ES here. So I've organized my talk around 4 parts, really, that share my own coming of age story as an environmental justice advocate and scholar, and how over time, through the many lessons and trials and tribulations, how I've come to transform my own relationship with the field of environmental studies. I open with my own journey to becoming an ES major here at Bowdoin, and really which served as my early radicalization coming from the classes that you all are sort of taking right now, right? And I wanted to end with my experiences organizing and researching in Chicago, Flint, and Jackson to think through what decolonization might look like in environmental studies. Indigenous activists have taught me that decolonization is not a metaphor, but a dedicated political practice. So how might we change our own approaches to environmental studies to map new ways to repair environmentalist relationships with Black and Indigenous communities? What might repair look like to Black and Indigenous communities who remain disproportionately impacted by climate disparities? And who continue to be harmed by how we train our students in environmental studies and how we approach the field of environmental studies more broadly. And by that, I mean environmental studies as a major, not unfamiliar to many of you, is riddled with justified critiques of settler colonialism and anti-Black racism. So as we celebrate the past 50 years, we must also consider the intergenerational harms that environmental studies have caused different communities, and use those legacies to think critically about reparations and how we shape our field in the future. How do we wrestle with those legacies to dream, like June Jordan did, of being okay now? Oh, it's moving, y'all. This is great. Okay, so full disclosure, and shout out to my grandma on the screen right there, rest in power. I did not grow up seeing myself as an environmentalist. My family is from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, but in the 1960s, my grandma migrated to D.C., leaving behind the cotton plantation of her childhood with the dreams of a better life. Instead of economic prosperity, she found what Stevie Wonder called living just enough for the city. So for all my Gen Zers in the room, if you haven't heard that song, your first assignment is to go home and listen to it in full. But what I mean by that is she left one form of rural poverty for another form of urban poverty. She served as a live-in domestic for St. Thomas Catholic Church, where she scraped and survived just enough to be able to move her children up to D.C. with her. And while Southeast was once a flourishing Black community where people foraged for food and caught catfish from the Anacostia River, by the time my grandmother came, the ravages of urban renewal had made its imprint. Southeast was now a highly polluted community cut off from the rest of D.C. by highways that allowed commuters who lived in Alexandria, Virginia, to commute to downtown D.C. with ease. So by the time I came of age in the early 2000s, I found myself growing up in a community where the nearest park took 2 buses to get to. The nearest full-line grocery store was a 60-minute bus ride away. And where the air smelled of sewage due to the neighboring wastewater facilities that dotted my neighborhood. So how did I even come to see myself as an environmentalist? Perhaps it was by random chance. So my high school required that we complete volunteer hours to graduate. And it just so happened that I was assigned to the Bladensburg Waterfront Park, which is a small nature education center that sits at the mouth of the Anacostia River. I arrived begrudgingly at 7 a.m. on a Saturday as a 17-year-old, but by the time I finished my first day, I was hooked. There was a bald eagle who flew across the river, great blue herons, vibrant trees dotting the Anacostia. I saw people fishing and had the opportunity to lead boat tours and to teach environmental education classes. Again, I was hooked. And I decided that I wanted to pursue environmental studies in college. I looked up schools with the top environmental studies programs, and no surprise, I discovered Bowdoin. I ended up majoring in history and environmental studies with a minor in Africana, as Matt alluded to. But while during my time at Bowdoin, I actually did a whole major exploration. So I thought I was going to do Arctic studies, then I landed on anthropology, and I finally came back to history. But even through all of those changes, one salient piece that never changed was my commitment to environmental studies. It was not always easy. In my first environmental studies intro course, I learned about climate change for the first time, and I immediately thought about the impact it would have on my community back in Southeast. We did not have the language of climate justice, but in my alarm, I realized that I was the only Black person in this class. While I took a lot away from environmental studies, I rarely saw my communities represented in our class debates. I also was the only Black student ES major in my year, and so I'm especially excited to see how much that is changing. Though I know there are still many more gains to be made in the department as the challenge to diversify both our students and our faculty remains critical. So if taking ES intro courses served as my first curricular introduction to the field, it was the environmental humanities courses that helped me see my own communities in the classroom. My first year writing seminar, I swear Matt stole my talk, but my first year writing seminar was with Matt, and he encouraged me to think about history as a tool to understand Southeast. He taught us to critically rethink the meaning of the Memphis sanitation strike and its relationship to both the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement. It was through these classes that I learned about the structural underpinnings that made environmental studies and environmental organizing so white. At the time, the prevailing stereotype that dominated these conversations around Black studies as environmental studies was that due to the legacies of slavery, Black people were apathetic to the environment and environmental issues. What, of course, was missing from these spaces, and shout out to Carolyn Finney's work on this, was how Western conceptualizations of wilderness and conservation was actively anti-Black. With the support of both Connie and Matt, I began to challenge these conceptualizations. And through their and many ES faculty support, I came to see that the Black freedom struggle was intrinsically linked to demands for healthy ecosystems and environmental justice. In this way, ES faculty encouraged me to pursue the interconnections between Black studies and environmental studies. And it was also through ES that I learned to see my own lived experiences through the critical terrain of environmental justice. I opened with my experiences growing up in Southeast, a place with a rich activism history that fills me with pride. Yet, admittedly, coming to Bowdoin and being surrounded by so much wealth for the very first time in my life led me to feel ashamed about where I grew up. It was because I saw my community as a victim and not an agent for social change. But through taking more advanced level courses with folks such as Jill Perlman, I began to see my community of Southeast, and particularly Berry Farms, as an environmental justice community who was on the forefront of environmental activism. Rather, through the environmental humanities here, I saw the roots of the environmental justice movement as a coalition of everyday people from communities just like mine. If my neighborhood did not have a full-line grocery store, it was due to legacies of segregation and policies that kept grocery stores from poor communities. And it was these legacies of urban renewal and even the war on drugs that left Southeast hyper-surveilled and over-policed. And in the face of such violence and extractivism, residents of Berry Farm were on the forefront of the welfare rights movement, where they were making demands for food and housing security, demanding green spaces so their children could blossom. And yet the city met their demands with more police and more prisons, cementing broken window policies. And now, decades after these long activist movements where residents demanded for revitalized communities, they now face forced dislocation through gentrification, as the mayor hopes to attract elites back into the city. In fact, DC's new tagline is, "You can now live where you work." The questions and critical thinking skills that my ES courses centered allow me to see research as a tool for activism and advocacy in my own neighborhood. I wanted to apply the critical histories, reading, and thinking skills to think more capaciously about the intersections between Black and environmental studies. My ES classes pushed me to develop a justice-oriented lens to environmental studies, and I was inspired to design research projects that allow me to think through Black people's environmental activism. For what good was solving the climate crisis if people would still go to bed hungry, lived in dilapidated housing, and did not have access to clean water? The common good shared with us at the start of Bowdoin's orientation was not just a phrase pasted on the website. It was embedded in our very classroom experience. It is embedded as who we are in this world. There we go. So my time at Bowdoin helped me see from my own lived experiences, sort of through this lens of environmental justice, and inspired me to pursue environmental justice as a career. However, the research experiences also provided by Bowdoin helped me critically interrogate what should be considered environmental issues in the first place. What are environmental justice issues, especially in the wake of widespread police violence? So if this talk wasn't being recorded, I would reveal the true title of this part, but let's just say I'm grateful for the rap group NWA's song on ending police violence. So while still a student at Bowdoin, I began to realize that there was a deep need to expand environmental justice issues beyond pollution to include the police. Through the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, I had the opportunity to do research at the University of Chicago. Unbeknownst to me at the time, my time as a student of environmental justice here would help me see the environmental inequalities of policing in Chicago as linked to urban development and the political and economic expansion of universities. In 2010, I arrived to the University of Chicago eager to work on my project on national parks and excited to be at a large university in such a diverse city. It was a very different place than Brunswick, Maine. But what I encountered, however, was how the university actively aided in constructing the surrounding Black community as a space of hyperviolence. During our orientation, 2 armed police officers warned us of exploring the south side of Chicago at the risk of our own safety. As I made friends with students from the south side, I quickly saw another picture. Their families invited me into their homes so I could have a home-cooked meal. I witnessed neighborhoods surrounded by waste plants, and I also witnessed Southside residents fighting for equitable revitalization. Instead of the so-called war zone that was described to me by the police, I saw a community in struggle not unlike my neighborhood in Southeast. In fact, it was the University of Chicago's campus that marked unbelonging and unwelcoming for me. Armed police officers made their mark on the campus. They walked around fully armed and aggressive. Those everyday moments of surveillance were irritating, but were only amplified with my own harrowing interaction with the campus police. On one sunny day, me and my friends, who were also Black UFC students, decided to hang out on a green space on campus to read for class. As we lounged and laughed, 2 UCPD officers approached us saying, quote, "You have to be students to hang out here." After explaining that we indeed were students, they demanded to see our IDs. The scene became increasingly humiliating as we were surrounded by white students who looked at us as if we had done something wrong. But more than humiliation, it was also fear. We recalled a Black PhD student who earlier that year was violently beaten by a UCPD officer for refusing to show his ID. We complied, but the taste in my mouth remained the same, and I vowed in all the wisdom that a 20-year-old has that I would never think about the University of Chicago again. But the experience nagged at me. And after graduating from Bowdoin in 2012, I realized that I wanted to go deeper into the study of environmental justice. I wanted to use my historical expertise to understand what happened to me and my friends, really to bring some sense of healing to that moment. I thought, what were the forms of state violence that Black people face in pursuit of outdoor leisure? I had, after all, been encouraged by so many ES faculty to take seriously my own research interests and to value what my positionality could bring to the table. I realized that that nagging feeling left by the University of Chicago was just the very foundations that I had been instilled with throughout my ES major, to ask difficult questions, to take your lived experiences seriously, and to always interrogate structures of power with rigor. Those lessons led to a deeper exploration of the history of the University of Chicago police force. I found that they were created, deputized, and armed not to combat the fictive narratives of crime as is popularly believed. Instead, the University of Chicago created their police force at a time when residential segregation was technically written out of law, which just so happened to coincide with an influx of African Americans into Hyde Park who could at least now on paper buy homes. University officials panicked that Hyde Park would go under like other neighborhoods around it. These are their words, not mine. That Hyde Park would shift from being predominantly white to being predominantly Black. The university's answer was to weld together a university private police force that could be the physical arm of urban renewal. The campus police first job was to go to different houses and businesses in Hyde Park to determine which were homes of ill repute and slums and which were respectable homes and spaces. In their construction of a pristine and green university, the University of Chicago wove together hyper-policing and surveillance to determine who is supposed to be where, and to eradicate the so-called blight from the university's greener visions. Their perspective was that a green and white campus would attract world-class faculty, and a majority Black neighborhood would do the opposite. In this way, urban environmental conservation became deeply entangled with modes of anti-Blackness and policing. In conclusion to that article, I found that organizations like Assata's Daughter were already rallying against the UCPD for destroying community garden beds that promised food security for the Black youth that they served. Seeing Assata's gardens as encroaching on university space, the UCP literally mowed down those gardens, an act to keep the barrier between Washington Park and Hyde Park very well defined. But most profoundly, in seeing the intersections between the ideologies of green sustainability and the police, there were critical questions of environmental justice that had not yet been fully explored. For who cared if all the air pollution was eradicated from Chicago if Black people still faced premature death at the hands of the police? I now saw campus police forces as another perpetrator of environmental injustice. The only question that remained in my heart was, what was I going to do about it? Fast forward to my time at Yale in 2017, I co-organized a campaign to abolish the Yale Police Department. We demanded that Yale start by de-arming them, and we also hoped to reimagine what campus safety ought to look like for everyone, no matter how you were affiliated with the institution. There were 2 incidents of police brutality on Yale's campuses in my first year alone. In one incident, a young couple was shot by the YPD while listening to music parked near the quad. In response, a coalition of Black students demanded the immediate disarmament of the YPD. Yale undergrads and grad students built off this activism 2 years later in joining the national movement of getting cops off campuses. And I encourage everyone in this room, to get involved in that campaign, as the battle to remove police off of campuses only becomes more urgent. At Yale, we questioned, look at me seamlessly doing this. Can I tell a quick aside? I'm gonna do it. When I was giving my job talk, like the fire alarm went off during the whole presentation. So when I tell you all I'm not even flustered right now, I'm so used to this type of stuff happening. So we're gonna keep going, okay?
You're a pro.
So, okay. At At Yale, we questioned why we needed fully armed police officers to de-escalate and increase public safety when it was the police that made Black students and residents alike feel unsafe. We also considered how there was such intensive funding for the police, but the narrative of municipal bankruptcy spread when activists demanded funds for safe housing and food access. There seemed to be endless dollars for so-called public safety, but never any money to fund programming that actually revitalized communities. Here's where I saw environmental justice organizations as being able to join in with the police abolitionists, who also were talking about land stewardship and feeding people, but in the absence of a militarized police force. What could be possible? But policing is not just an environmental justice issue. It is an issue for all environmental organizations. All too easily, Black communities are often siloed in environmental studies as environmental justice topics. Or Black communities come up the one week that professors are teaching on environmental justice. But in Black people's experiences, practices, and own theorizations reveal to me how indispensable Blackness is to how we construct the environment, and how Black communities upend our very approaches to the study of the environment. One way this became clear to me is through Black activist demands for police and prison abolition. For it's only through abolition that we will heal the land from the long legacy of environmental exploitation. So I want to say thank you to Assata's daughters and to my beloveds on the south side of Chicago for showing me that the only environmental future is an abolitionist one, for helping me to expand my own notions of environmental justice so that the subfield I love so much can always be responsive to present liberatory needs. And for my students of color in the room, for my Black and Indigenous people in the room, know that your ideas, experiences, and dreams have the power to change how we think across fields. Keep speaking up and keep paving the way. So in a longer iteration of my talk, I spent about 30 minutes gushing about all that Eileen and Rosie did for me during my 4 years, and how I learned so much from Eileen and other ES faculty beyond the environmental humanities. And I truly do wish I had 2 hours with you all tonight. But I would be remiss if I did not thank Eileen for teaching me that community-engaged research is a long-time commitment. And I would be thinking of Eileen in 2015 during the height of the Flint water crisis. And before I get into this story, I want to amplify that Flint residents are still fighting for clean water. They are still fighting for reparations, and I continue to stand in solidarity with Nayera Sharif and many of the other Black feminist organizers I was blessed to work alongside. So in 2015, I found myself 40 minutes south of Flint, Michigan during the height of the water crisis. Thanks again to the encouragement and support of ES faculty, I was accepted to the university's Ann Arbor's program to study environmental justice with the renowned environmental justice scholar, Dorceta Taylor, whose work I actually became familiar with in Matt's class. So I came to University of Michigan to learn about environmental justice organizing, and thanks to Black organizers on the ground, I left Michigan with a deeper understanding of community participatory research in the realm of environmental studies. In my classroom experiences at the University of Michigan, I learned about community organizing and putting your body on the line for your comrades, all topics I loved. But I was taught these topics in a format very disconnected from the people on the actual ground. We learned about community participation without any community. And I knew this was backwards. And having the honor to learn from Eileen, I knew it was backwards. If backwards, it was not unsurprising, as through Flint, I would learn firsthand how implicit universities are in enforcing structural racism throughout their wider communities. When the national news first broke out about the Flint water crisis, residents had known that their water was poisoned for 2 years prior, but they had actively been ignored by environmental NGOs, the University of Michigan, and the EPA. The University of Michigan, which boasts the oldest environmental justice program in the country, had no authentic context on the ground in which to help. The university itself, even though it has a campus on Flint, tried to distance itself with displays of sympathy, but little accountability to Flint. They did little to share their large endowment to even try to rally their own financial resources. And it's easy for me to levy critiques against institutions, as we all should be critiquing these institutions. But Flint also taught me how I was at risk of adopting research practices that harmed communities. Even as I was armed with my own set of radical sense of outrage, I entered Flint with the hope of applying the principles I learned in the classroom in real life. I love this tweet. Yes, baby. Okay, I got there with my survey in hand to study the impact of the water crisis. And my name is Teona. I'm an EJ major at Ann Arbor, led to doors slammed in my face repeatedly, deservedly repeatedly. I was an agent of the university, a university that had ignored residents for 2 years, on a project funded by a foundation that had actively ignored residents for 2 years. So who was I to Flint? And what was my little survey actually going to change? Flint forced me to recognize how the very nature of academic study was fraught, even in the field of environmental justice, where we set out to prove people's suffering to justify their need for resources. I was tasked to collect quantitatively and qualitatively data on the worst days of people's lives. How many rashes do you have? When did your son die of lead poisoning? How many bottles of water do you use to shower each day? The poking and the prodding. When people did not need another story, they needed safe drinking water. Community-engaged research is not about building trust so that we as scholars can swoop in, extract data we need to publish and move on. The data meant nothing if at the end of the day, scholars like myself went home and drank the tap water when my comrades in Flint could not. People are not data, they are people. And I knew that I needed to pivot to make sure those politics were front and center. I ended up pivoting my labors. I partnered alongside Communities First, a very small nonprofit working on housing and food insecurity in Flint, to get a sense of the types of resources, spaces, and programming that the community was demanding. People wanted to know that the drinking fountains in their neighborhood parks were safe. They wanted their kids to be able to play at the playgrounds or even to have opportunities to get outside of Flint, as many before this time would travel to northern Michigan to ski and to go to the lakes to swim. People wanted a return to normalcy, not for themselves, but for the sake of their children. They wanted the home water deliveries to continue, as you needed a car to get downtown, and even if you could rely on the kindness of friends or public transportation, how could one successfully haul enough bottled water to get through the day, let alone a full week? They wanted political change, as it was Michigan's failed experimentation in emergency management that effectively rendered powerless the local and elected government in Flint, who were replaced by emergency managers who put profits over people. And while we could not deliver on everything, I learned from Flint what it meant to be a visitor in someone else's community. It means learning from the histories of oppression that shaped the area, organizing around those issues, and it means levying whatever privileges that you have to do what you have to do. During my time in Flint, I created a report on the types of community development projects that residents were interested in, like the Black Ski Week. Communities First used this report to apply for new funding, including the Black Ski Weekend for Flint youth. After my summer in Flint, I went back to Ann Arbor and I organized with other students across public health and environmental justice. We were able to secure funds that would allow us to partner with a local church to deliver water every weekend directly to people for the next 2 years. And so I want to say thank you to Flint for teaching me what it meant to be a good visitor. Environmental justice may be introduced in the classroom, but trust me, it's best learned in the streets. May one day clean water be a human right. And unfortunately, Flint would not be the last time I found myself in a majority Black city facing a water crisis. In 2021, while completing my dissertation research, I found myself living through the first of many Jackson, Mississippi water crises. There we go. So if y'all can't tell by now, water inequality and police violence has radicalized me in so many ways. So I want to end with Jackson to offer my experiences there as marking my own coming of age as a Black feminist and as an environmental justice scholar. So on February 15th, 2021, Jackson was covered in snow and ice. And what at first felt like a whimsical snow day quickly turned into homes reaching 20 degrees on the inside. A typical southern city, most of the houses in Jackson do not have heating systems. So as the temperatures dropped outside, so did the temperatures drop inside of the homes. At the time, I was staying with a Black feminist-led land cooperative in the west side of neighborhood in Jackson. I just want to show y'all the picture of it. So the land trust emerged as a way to fight back against gentrification and food insecurity through economic development initiatives. The co-op was already fighting for resources when 2 back-to-back snowstorms hit Jackson, causing the majority Black city to lose heat, power, and water for 6 to 8 weeks, depending on where you lived on the grid. A snow and ice disaster only exacerbated the economic and food disaster that had already marked Black residents' lives. In response, Black women elders in my community initiated a series of mutual aid projects to help those who felt the brunt of the storm. Just so you can see some of these pictures. It got bad down there, y'all. Okay. They distributed blankets, shared food, and disseminated bottles of water. The white supermajority government in Mississippi had already abandoned Jackson so many times. And so Black women knew no one was coming to save us. They knew that no one was coming for us but us. And it was through these mutual aid projects that I learned about how Black feminism is its own form of weatherization. Black feminism became its own disaster relief in areas long abused by legacies of white flight and divestment. Black feminists in Jackson quickly rallied to ensure the survival of their communities. So the co-op mobilized and survived. For as famed Mississippi civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer mandated, and I quote, "If the name of the game is survive, survive." And I thought of Hamer in this winter storm, perhaps because Rouville, where she lived, was less than 2 hours north of me. Perhaps because she modeled the radical possibilities of warmth that Alexis Pauline Gumbs wrote as the precondition to climate healing. I imagine the warmth of Hamer. I imagine how she would have weathered the Jackson water crisis and the winter storm. In her lifetime, she weathered many disasters. In the aftermath of a set of deadly tornadoes, 100 to be exact, that struck Rouville, she bankrupted her own land cooperative in order to ensure that every tornado survivor had food in their stomachs and clothes on their backs. It was her light and energy that filled my dreams and broke the methodicalness of cold and darkness that accompanied having no power for weeks. Instead of being filled with dread at my own situation, I mobilized in honor of Hamer. So I want to say thank you to Jackson and thank you to Fannie Lou Hamer for teaching me how to survive disaster in real time, for teaching me about mutual aid, and how to spread warmth as a form of resistance against state neglect and vulnerability to ecological catastrophe. And I want to end my talk here on Jackson, not only because, like their comrades in Flint, they are still fighting for safe drinking water access, but because my time there also helped me see the next iteration of environmental activism and scholarship. My time in Jackson forced me to reckon with state abandonment and neglect on a deeply, deeply personal level. It taught me about Black feminism and how Black women are often on the forefront of mediating environmental calamities. Jackson forced me to reckon with what does repair look like across generations of anti-Black and patriarchal violences that many Black Jacksonians can directly trace back to slavery. And how in our critiques of state intervention and our newfound embrace of a mutual aid, Can we never forget the reparations that are owed both by the state and the federal government, the reparations they owe to Black diasporic communities? Rather, the fight for environmental justice is not just a battle for stronger environmental regulations and protections. It is also grounded on demands for land back and reparations. So I want to hopefully bring into conclusion these stories I have shared and to think about how environmental futures as rooted in repair might look like. For as Toni Morrison once shared with her own students, and I quote, "When you get these jobs you're so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is to free somebody else." I take that to mean that no matter what career you choose, no matter where your destiny leads you, that our biggest responsibility is to each other. That we have a shared fate and our collective liberation is intrinsically linked. So what are we fighting for? What are the types of futures that we envision for people in the more than human world? You all as students are particularly primed to help and dream of even more radical ideas than my generation or the generation before me did. So I want to end with a question for you all to consider, and I want you really to consider it. What does the next 50 years of environmental studies look like? When some of us are here gathering for the 100th anniversary, what do we want our legacy, our gift to future generations to be? And this question is important because of the historical and contemporary ways that environmental studies is practiced, which I know I alluded to. Even as environmental studies more and more contends with its own sordid racial histories, the field largely continues to violently extract while also simultaneously erasing how indispensable Black communities are to solving our most ardent environmental crises. So this question of where do we go from here and how do we engage in reparative politics seems more urgent more than ever before. And I ask myself these same questions. How do I, as a Black woman, first-generation college student, reconcile my deep commitment to environmental studies with the very communities I'm also accountable to? How do I claim ES as my home, but make it my radical home? As a Black feminist historian, I find myself relying more and more on the ancestors to help me think through my own future in ES. So I want to end with Françoise Burgess, whose work has inspired my own hope for the field. She writes on climate change and ecological calamity and how we're taught to see ourselves as individuals rather as people who are deeply, deeply entangled. We have been told how individualism is the only way for humans to progress. But what if individualism and growth was not our modus operandi? What if, as disability scholars around the world have noted, that dependency is actually the only way to survive the end of the world? That we need each other and our more than human kin to make livable worlds? And that this dependency on each other is not extractive as is sometimes practiced, but is a dependency rooted in love. For as Françoise writes, quote, "To live, we need to breathe, to be held and to hold, to be loved and to love, to make kin and communities," end quote. It is a hegemony that wants to see us isolated from one another. It is a hegemony that marks both Black lives and the environment as always disposable, always exploitable, and always sacrificable. And so the only way to break away from these patterns is to put our bodies on the line for each other. This is what Fannie Lou Hamer meant when she said, "No one's free until everyone's free." No one's free until everyone is free. And it is our collective dependency that holds the plight of Chicago and Flint and Jackson. I know I took y'all on a journey, as one very big battle for environmental justice in this country. It is my experiences in these places that allow me to move beyond what ES was as I had been taught and what ES needed to mean. And so for me, the next 50 years of environmental studies, as I will practice it, will be rooted in abolitionist futures. Environmental studies, as I will now practice it, demands, as Ruth Lee Gilmore demands as well, that abolition has to be green. For we must abolish environmental racism and environmental degradation. Environmental studies, as I now will practice it, has to center the needs and the well-being of those most vulnerable, Because if you help the most marginalized, you will, through extension, help everyone. And yes, my environmental studies, as I will practice it, will join in the demands of police and prison abolitionists for us to rethink how we approach community well-being and safety. Rather, by defunding the police, it will give us the opportunity to refund grassroots organizations and community development programs. Environmental studies, as I will practice it, centers the knowledge and approaches of Black and Indigenous communities who have already lived through millions of apocalypses. From here on out, environmental studies for me will be emancipatory. It will be used to help break chains. It will center that our future generations are actually our greatest gift. And yes, my ES knows that through all the violence and heartache, the setbacks after setbacks after setbacks, that if we stand with each other, if we clasp each other's hands and promise each other that we will never let each other go, that yes, one day we will be free. So for my tree warriors fighting against Cop City in Atlanta, we see you. For my comrades in Jackson fighting for clean water through the lens of eco-socialism, we see you. For all my comrades who are organizing for our collective future, we see you. We love you, we thank you, and we will join you in this fight. And I want to end by thanking once again June Jordan for showing me that this is the only way, and for thanking Fannie Lou Hamer for showing me that this is the only way. And of course, thank you all for being here and being in community with us as we commemorate such an important legacy. Thank you. To all of you. Can I say one more thing? Sorry. If Kevin is still here, I want to deeply apologize for the mess that's on this floor. Deeply, deeply apologize.
I'll tell you sometime about how my slides caught on fire. Do you want to sit in the chair?
You know what? I'm feeling amped up. I
All
just
right.
said, let's do it.
All right. So just like I said, full send. So if I could ask people in the audience, we have a microphone here and a microphone here. I think they are turned on. There's a lot that we can ask questions about, and I hope that people would. And so back over to you.
Thank you.
Come on up, don't be shy. Do you want to ask a question, Jill?
No, I'm waiting for you.
Can I just say, I think I'm really just blown away by that presentation. So it takes me a few minutes.
Paul, use a microphone.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that, Paul. And we can reflect too. I mean, I seriously, as I continue to sort of reconcile my own relationship with this field, I do think it's critically important for each and every one of you all to think about, what does the next 50 years of environmental studies look like? Oh, first question. Make it a softball one.
Yeah, this is softball. You brought up briefly Ruth Wilson Gilmore in your presentation, and I've been reading her recently, and I just find myself really drawn to the idea that she says that at the end of the day, freedom is a place.
Yes.
Could you just talk about that and your thoughts on kind of that idea in relation to your work with environmental justice and ES?
Oh, yes, for sure. So just to give you some a little contextual background, you know, when these ideas of abolitionism first emerged, what everybody was sort of saying was just you know, how this is sort of impractical, impossible, you know, truly sort of this abolition is as a place, you know, exists in sort of this radical spatial imaginary that has no real grounding in our lifetime. And what Ruthie is sort of saying is that no, absolutely, abolition is something that we can aim for. It has concrete demands. It is a place, it's a destination that we can arrive to. And I think about that like in my own work, because a lot of like the women I study, you know, materially speaking, have very, very little. So it's not like they're like a nature conservancy or something, right? Where, you know, they're founding these like environmental organizations that will like last for like hundreds of years or something of that nature. But they were fighting for abolition, and they were like in their own hyper-local place-making practices, were trying to have us like radically rethink our relationship to the more than human world, and also radically rethink our relationship to each other. And I do think these are things that are possible in the here and now, as I like to say it. These are things that we can commit to, and these are things that we can work toward and see in our generation. Y'all don't have to clap after questions.
Hello. So I loved your idea about like the intersectionality between like environmental studies and like kind of the communities you care about. So I guess my question is, where do I start? Like, where do you want the people in the audience to start? Do you start with learning more about the communities that you care about, or do you start with foundation in environmental studies? Or is it kind of like a balance between both? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, did I cut you off? Oh, no, okay. I think you all start right here in this place. You know, Bowdoin is a community, right? Like, Brunswick is a community. There are opportunities and things that you all can sort of do to sort of build communities in this particular place. And then as you sort of emerge, you move beyond Brunswick, maybe you move beyond Maine, you can reinstate those same practices of like what it means to sort of like think of yourself as being in place in a community. So something that I'm trying to challenge myself to do, and this is why I love this question because I've been thinking about it a lot, is I'm from D.C., and now I've recently sort of moved to New Jersey. I'm building a life there. Are you from Jersey? Is that why? Oh, so okay. Well, shout out. Anyway, but I'm sort of thinking about that. Like, how do I sort of like now build these community connections, do all this type of work? And for me, where I arrived is sort of like my first step is to be a political comrade. You know, I'm not coming into any community for a research project, for a grant, or for a publication. I'm coming in on my own time, showing my own dedication, and showing that I see myself as like a member in this neighborhood, as a member in this community. And so I do think you can do that type of work to continue to make Bowdoin, you know, a better place, to continue to make Brunswick a better place, continue to make Maine a better place. It doesn't always have to be us like, you know, everybody run into Flint to try to do some type of organizing. You can think about like what it means to build community where you are right now.
Dr. Williams, you know, through your presentation, I got how your life history and your identity inform your worldview. And so I'm wondering how, for those of us who are cultured within like more dominant white frameworks, how we can adopt these abolitionary frameworks that you are proposing and kind of like switch our worldview.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think, you know, first of all, like whiteness is an identity. You know, I think so often we think of like, okay, here are these set of like racial identities, and we never like include white people in that, or we never include whiteness in that. So I think that's sort of like the very first starting place. And to sort of think about sort of like the legacies and the privileges that are attached to like your whiteness, or attached to your sort of proximity to whiteness, and use that as opportunities to unlearn if you're at that space, and to also to sort of like critically like engage, to sort of check your privileges. And now when you're sort of interacting with like maybe a more vulnerable community than your own, you're not coming in as like, oh, like I'm this expert, or I'm like this or that. You're coming in saying like, I'm just like here to listen. You know, I'm here to figure out how I use my own privileges from this proximity to whiteness to figure out how to get you what you need. these communities know what they need. So we have like these sort of unique sort of privileges to sort of say like, okay, you've said what you need, now it's up to me to help figure out how to get it. So I don't think that like you have to be a person of color to be an abolitionist. There's plenty of white abolitionists out there. But I do think it takes sort of a lot of like checking your own privileges, checking like your own like arrogance too. Like I've talked to sort of people who've been organizing like in indigenous communities, white people, and you know, they have like such like a distaste for the fact that it's not easily for them to be sort of accepted in these spaces. And maybe you'll never be accepted in those spaces, and that's totally okay. You can find like your own space to organize, you can still donate, you can still send bottles of water to both Jackson and Flint without feeling the need to sort of have to take up space and to feel like, you know, I have to be the one front and center in doing this sort of work. So, you know, just go forth, do it.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for giving this lovely talk. It's been really cool to hear about your journey, like in the Bowdoin classroom, and now you're going to be starting an assistant professorship in the fall. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I have another year, y'all. Thank you. Thank you.
But kind of like thinking about all those moments and kind of your time at Bowdoin that really inspired you or kind of ignited things in you, and then transitioning into teaching yourself. I would love to hear more about like how you're envisioning your pedagogy, anti-racism in the classroom, and how you kind of hope to kind of give those moments that you got at Bowdoin to future students.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of a really great question because, you know, even at my like institution, environmental studies is still largely dominated by a lot of like wealthy and elite people, and so my sort of like guide, a shepherd as them sort of like in students is really sort of helping them sort of think about like how they have sort of like a stake in the game, how they have like, what's the sort of saying when they say you have teeth in the game or something, how they have teeth in the game, right? And I think for me where Bowdoin became so critical, you know, it definitely did come from the place of feeling like I was like the only one like in these classes. And I think from that, I developed like such a deep empathy to try to sort of figure out like how to like have like more diverse spaces in the sort of like the classroom for people who look like me, to be honest. And even for people who don't look like me, like how am I still going to sort of like teach them? How am I going to sort of bring them in? I admit, like, I don't get it right all the time. Like, I was teaching last semester this, like, environment, society, and justice class, and I'm still coming in here thinking, like, oh, my God, this is going to be so, like, lit. We're going to do all these things, and then we're going to do, like, a protest. We're going to do all this stuff. And it's just like, you know, they weren't there yet. I had to meet them where they were. And, you know, by the end of it, I had them do these environmental justice zines, and they killed it, right? So a lot of the times when I'm thinking about that, it's just like, you know, remembering my own experiences in the classroom, but also sort of remembering that we always have to meet people where they are. And like, how do we sort of like take them on the journey, you know, with you? And for me, my biggest gift is just like, I am actually like politically and deeply, and I'm not ashamed to say it, committed to the topics that I study. And I feel like my only responsibility, the only reason why I stay in academia at all, is to sort of create those sort of insurgent class spaces where more students can sort of feel like this is also their political responsibility and obligations. And it's trial and errors, but I think the more students, at least in my experience, that sort of see that like you truly care about them and you truly are passionate and that these things matter, then by the end of the class, like I was just like, I'm so over y'all, like da 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 da. But by the end of it, like we had gone on this really beautiful journey together, and they were even able to celebrate themselves. I'm a very handsy person, y'all. And they even were able to sort of celebrate themselves and see like, where did I start in week 1? Maybe I was even just like really struggling in this class. And now look at me at week 15. It is unfair. We have to teach 15 weeks at Rutgers. But where I end up at week 15, and they're very proud of it. They're like, I can sort of see this progress. And I do that by just saying like, you know, I meet you where you are. I level you up where you feel like you need to be leveled up. And I don't try to, like, you know, make you into something you're not. I just try to show you, you know, what they say. You can bring the horse to the water, but you can't make them drink it. I just bring rivers into class and see what's going to happen from them, you know?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was just curious to hear you talk a little bit more. Like, a lot of the things you were describing, and I think you made a reference to this, sort of sounded like extra academic, so like outside the traditional academic context. And I was really curious to hear a little bit more about, like, how did you then sort of integrate that stuff that you were doing, like, into your scholarship? And then, like, did you get pushback from the folks you were studying under, or were they really receptive to that? Like, what kind of reaction did you get from the folks you were working with?
Yeah. You know, I think, and I know probably Connie and Matt will be like, this is probably like not sustainable, so ask me this question in 5 years. But I think I just sort of made a political commitment to myself that these things will never mix. Because I feel like any sort of like moment that you're sort of like coming into a community that is already deeply struggling with any sort of vision of like, how can I make this like a grant, or how can I sort of like make this or sort of that, you know, then this was sort of my lesson when I'm trying to tell y'all, like in Flint, right? I'm just like, okay, it's this water crisis. You know, I have all these skills in environmental justice. You know, I'm about to make my name as an environmental justice activist in Flint. Like, you can't kind of help that own your own arrogance, you know, even as a low-income Black woman. So I think for me, for now, I will say, I've just sort of made the political decision that, like, you know, that is sort of like something that is sanctified outside of like the university. And I think there's sort of benefits to that too, because to be honest, like, not every department is going to be excited. Even if you are turning out publications on it, they're not going to sort of value it as like equal sort of like work anyway. So that's what I'm sort of like convincing myself and convincing my chair, who's like, well, maybe you could do like a community engaged course on this. And I was just like, no, you know, this work is sacred work. You know, it's not meant to sort of cross over here. Now, how sustainable that is, like, you know, I'm not up for tenure yet, so I have no idea, like, what that's going to look like for me. But for now, it's just been very special.
Thank you so much for coming to speak. It's been amazing to have you. And I have a question I was thinking a lot about. You gave a lot of examples that kind of bridged both collective action but also individual action. And I think, you know, like, there's the tension classically described with recycling is a very easy example. Like, you recycle, it probably does nothing, but the system has to be set up to recycle so that there is some larger change. And I'm curious how you see that tension play out in your work, especially when it comes to something that might not be as tangible as recycling, thinking about identity or race or these like legacies of constructs that have been, you know, like slavery, which might not no longer exist today, but still has a tangible impact. And so where that falls with your work, with students maybe protesting or making zines, but then also on this like larger policy scale.
Yeah, for sure. Like, the first thing I thought is just that, you know, no sort of racial group is like a monolith. So they're like, even in like sort of my own sort of archival research, there are like really sort of like deep battlegrounds between different civil rights organizations. So, you know, there's the Fannie Lou Hamer sort of troop who's just like, you know, I'm in it for like this long-term vision, but like, let me just sort of focus on my community's like immediate needs. So like, if we could still convince like the Ford Foundation to like send us money, we're not going to use it how they want us to use it. We're going to use it for these things. And there's other like civil rights activists who, you know, this is now sort of becoming a career, right? So they can sort of like, you know, get a 401k off of like trying to like end for food security. So I do think there's sort of like, even in my work, I see sort of like those like tensions and, you know, those sort of conflicts arising. So I just want to center like, you know, I don't think what I'm talking about here is anything sort of like easy, but I think of how that sort of like translates in the policy like realm. You know, I think it requires no additional labors on, you know, abolitionist organizers or communities, because they have actually clearly sort of mapped out what the policy looks like, right? Like what it would mean to like have a community with no police officers, all those types of sort of things. But it's more so like the onus is on like our politicians, and I'm not a political person, so I don't even know if I can speak to this, to be honest, but you know, the onus is on to like our politicians and things like that to sort of like acknowledge these ongoing sort of like works. So, you know, for example, you brought up, you know, something like slavery. And I will tell you, like, from my, you know, ethnographic research in Mississippi, there was no family that I didn't talk to who couldn't tell you, like, okay, where their descendants of enslaved person talk to. The resistance sort of comes from, like, politicians and governors are sort of like, but slavery was, like, you know, hundreds of years ago, this isn't sort of like relevant, but for the communities on the ground, they do think about the afterlives of slavery. They do think these things are relevant. So I feel like the onus really is on people who have higher levels of power to finally acknowledge and see that work. Yeah, I don't know what else like abolitionist communities could do. I hope that answered your question. It was beautiful.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for being here. It was amazing. My name is Megan, and I just had a quick question. I'm currently working for the Climate Initiative. We're based in Kennebunk, Maine, but something I think a lot about in my work, that intro is not necessary, sorry, but something I think a lot about is sort of working with youth and students around climate issues and activism. Something that comes up a lot is this very real and understandable sense of loss in their own communities, whether that's landscape, homes, livelihood, clean resources like we've been talking about, and yet how that drives them and myself forward like in our climate work. And so if you're willing to answer this, I just wonder if you're willing to talk about how it feels for you to sort of hold this like real grief and loss in one hand and like hope that keeps us going in the other, because I feel like both are, at least in my experience, have been super necessary in this work. Thank you.
Oh, I love that. You know, I'm actually going to be on an American Studies Association panel on like grief and mourning. So I actually think that these questions are sort of like critically important. And I guess how I hold it together is like, to me, like grief is sort of like the deepest level to me of love that you can show, you know? So for example, you know, I have like these chapters on Fannie Lou Hamer. And I always know the part of the archives, the part of the journey where she's dying of breast cancer. I know it's coming. I believe Hamer knew it was coming. And each time I'm like crying. And my goal for myself is to never stop crying, right? I never want to sort of get to the place where I'm so desensitized by, you know, the massive amount of Black death I see in my research, where it's just like I can't hold that grief in the same way that like I celebrate their wins and like their hopes. And what I will say is just like, you know, I'm just very like blessed because the women I'm studying, from Fannie Lou Hamer to Unita Blackwell to June Jordan, like they're all like women who literally, you know, on their deathbed, many of them like, and you know, here's another topic for later, many of them are also diagnosed within like 5 to 10 year periods of breast cancer. And in like their sort of like last moments, like their last acts, like for June Jordan, she was just like, I have to figure out how to sort of get this novel on radical land reform out. You know, for Toni Cade Bambara, it's just like, I have to make sure this like community land trust in Philadelphia works out. For Fannie Lou Hamer, it was just like, I have to figure out how to reinstate like the freedom farms. So I think like for them, I think about that, like even in these sort of like moments, and I can't even imagine what it means to sort of like go through this slow death of cancer. But even in those sort of like moments, like what they're saying is just like, you know, and we're still sort of fighting. So I don't think sort of these like things between like hope and grief for me are like at contention, because I think we need both. And I think like the moment we stop mourning and the moment we stop grieving, you know, is the time we need to reassess like our place in this work. And maybe it just means like I need to like do some healing myself so I can come back into this feeling. But it is hard.
So thank you for an excellent talk. I would like to try a thought exercise on you that maybe comes back to the end of your talk. So let's say it's 10 years from now. You've published excellent books. You've done really important activism. You've gotten tenure. And someone says to you, okay, Professor Williams, which I think rolls off the tongue very easily, what are the 5 required courses to be an environmental studies major? And I want you to take that in the context of a place like Bowdoin, where we really have embraced, in my estimation, the fact that there's a chemist in a room and a photographer in the same room and an environmental historian in the room, and yet somehow students are ostensibly paying a fair amount of money and they need a certain number of credit hours to graduate. You got 5 required courses.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a really good question. And not to do the sort of whole panel thing, it's just like I want to think about it. But I think I want to think about it because, I actually think sort of it's like a critically important question. And I often sort of like return, to like my own like pedagogical introduction into environmental studies to think about like, okay, what are the courses that I wish I would have taken? What are the courses like I could have taken? How do they sort of like relate to each other? And so this is not going to answer your question, but I think that's okay. Is that something I've been sort of thinking about, and like, I truly like mean this from like the sweetest of intentions. Like, I'm not trying to diss any scientist in the room. Y'all do great work, but it was sort of like never like my calling until sort of like, this year, I started, and we're 2 historians probably bumbling at it, but we started like reading sort of like this botany book on plants. And I'm like struggling to get through it because I'm realizing that like, at least from like my archival research, there's just like so many like Black women who are using certain types of plants like sassafras to cure this or to cure that. And then people are asking me like, well, tell me more about sassafras. And I'm just like, I have like no idea. Like, I probably pick it out from like Google or something like that. And so I think that that's sort of like the challenge. That's why I can't answer this question, because I feel like the challenge I'm sort of like in is sort of just like even rethinking for myself what those 5 required courses are. And I think like before this sort of like journey that these rural Black feminists have taken me on, which expands just so much, I probably would have gave you like a very biased answer, right? Well, you have to take like a North American or global environmental history course. You have to take at least 2 environmental justice courses, 1 intro, 1 advanced, maybe you do need to take an ecology class or something like that, but I don't think it would be sort of like, that actually feels like very generic to me as I'm sort of like on this journey for myself to reorient myself in the field. And, to also like heal my relationship with the sciences in many ways, which has been super extractive to these communities that I'm like organizing in. And so I want to sort of do that like with justice, because even in the department that I'm in, it's just very like interdisciplinary. I think I sort of came in like already ready to sort of fight, where I was just like, y'all are not going to respect my work, let's go, that type of energy. But so many people were like, well, I want to like put you in touch with this like soil scientist who's also like a Marxist. And so he's writing on soil Marxism. And I'm just like, what? Scientists do that? Like, really? Okay. So I feel like I'm in my own sort of like reorientation right now to figure out like what that will look like for me. I know that's not an answer to your question, but I feel like we're all on this journey together.
Okay, I hope it's a good one. First, thank you so much for coming, and just deep gratitude for all the organizing work that you're doing. That's so incredibly important. And as you said, thank you for bringing Black feminist thought into this conversation in such a big way. And I think if we think about what's missing from the conversation of environmental studies and what we need in the next 50 years, it's Black feminist thought. And of course, environmental justice is kind of a natural home for that. And I would hope that's included in those conversations. But are there ways that you would recommend that we can incorporate Black feminist thought into other aspects of environmental studies, like maybe science, policy, history, so on and so forth?
Oh, for sure. Like, so I highly, and I think, you all, not ES, but Bowdoin hosted Alexis Polly Gums like a month or so back, maybe. But like, I think like her work on like marine mammals is exactly like that type of like bridge, right? Where she's sort of thinking, at least like in the science level, like what would be, a Black feminist approach to marine biology. And she's still reading her like standard like marine biology, like one-on-one textbooks, but like using the lens and her expertise as a Black feminist scholar to sort of like really rethink like, what that should look like. So I highly recommend you read Undrowned. But I also brought her up because I think Audre Lorde is someone, she's going to be writing this beautiful bio on her. But like Audre Lorde is someone who I've sort of found out like late in the game. Like I knew her for like her Black queer politics, and I do want to say, I'm talking in a rounds, but we do also have to put in Black queer theory into this future of environmental studies as well. But like when she's sort of like documenting Hurricane Hugo in 1989 in St. Croix, she's also sort of doing these like very sort of deep studies, because she's sort of trying to figure out like in this sort of like moment, like why is it that like the federal government is bringing in guns and not diapers, right? So I think there's just like so many that I could like recommend to you. But it does like sort of take like, I think like a reorienting, because I know I certainly wasn't trained to sort of think that like, oh, maybe think about Black feminist philosophy in relation to like environmental studies. I wasn't trained like that. So I feel like in a way, like I'm also on that sort of journey of self-discovery. But like the more I search, the more I find. So definitely. Every time I'm like standing in a puddle of water, I feel so bad.
Why?
Because